Cameras on. We're going to have to switch a little bit gears from our little discussion we were just having into a little bit more of a serious topic. So please don't all tune out on me on this. We are now approaching around 100,000 deaths in the Syrian civil war. How did this start, the Syrian civil war? Did it start as a civil war? And who's fighting it anyway? Come on, news junkies.
Well, it didn't start as a civil war. It started as against the regime of Assad.
And you know
well, that's a civil war.
Well, no. Hold on a second. Wait a second.
It
When the suffragettes were chaining themselves to the railings to get a vote in America, does that count as a civil war? When people were marching in Alabama to get the equal rights for African Americans and other minorities, is that a civil war?
No.
No, a civil war, you know,
Is when
war equals death. You got to have fighting to make it a civil war. You can have government crackdown on protesters. That doesn't really count as a war. That counts as killing, but it's not war, not killing from both sides. And really in Syria, it didn't start off as a civil war. It started off as protests. And the protests were really for democracy. I need a bigger board. For democracy. The first protesters that went to the streets in the thousands in Damascus and other parts of Syria said, look, Egypt is going the way of democracy, Tunisia is going the way of democracy, at least that's what everybody thought at the time. We want to vote too, because the Assads have been running our country for decades, and quite frankly, it's not exactly the best situation in the world. We think that the people should have a say, and we would like to vote. So the people went out in the streets and they protested peacefully for months, very, very peacefully. Well, they were peaceful. And what was the response from the government? Was it to sit down and have conversations, to get the leaders of the protests together and talk about transitional stages of governance?
Yeah, it was turning into.
There was a brutal crackdown with lots of torture. Lots of torture. Syrians are very good at torture. And this then generated violent opposition. That is to say that the civilians saw the Assad regime is not going to even talk about some transitional stages that we could have towards democracy. And in fact, not only are they not going to talk, but if we go out in the street and just say, you know, we shall overcome, or Kumbaya, or pick whatever Syrian protest song you might have had, they'll shoot us. And they'll drag people into to prison cells, and they'll torture them, and children as well. Well, the only way we're going to get the Assad regime to go so that we can have room for democracy is going to be violence. Apparently, that was going to be the only option. And so they began a violent uprising and began really what would then turn into a civil war.
It wasn't a Sunni Shiite problem at all.
So, what is it now? Is it now, when we think of the rebels who are fighting against Assad, and we use the big word rebel, is it hundreds of thousands of democracy-loving freedom fighters that just want to get rid of Assad because they want to have a nice constitutional secular democracy? No. There are thousands of people fighting against Assad because that's what they want. And there are also thousands of people fighting because they are Sunni, because they are Shiite, because they are Hezbollah now, because they have different views of how the country should be run. And at the moment, unfortunately, it seems that the majority of the people who are doing the fighting aren't necessarily fighting for democracy. They are fighting for their own particular view of what Syria should become.
Right. For their own power.
For their own power, exactly. And their view does not include, fair and free elections. Their view involves Assad shouldn't be in charge, I should be in charge. And once I'm in charge, then I'll be the one who gets to torture the people that are wrong. Which is not exactly an easy situation then for America or the rest of the international community to figure out what to do. Because, we we like the idea of democracy taking over. We like that notion in general. Some little devil in the details in that conversation, but that's for another day. But we're not necessarily sure that everything that might come out of Syria would be better than Assad. That whoever gets to the top of this bloody pile of bodies would necessarily be better than Assad. Assad is pretty terrible, but some of the alternatives would be equally terrible or perhaps even worse. And so we are stuck now trying to figure out the best way to ensure the best type of transition for Syria to meet what we believe would be in the best interests of her people and the world. And it all began because someone raised a sign that said, "We want a vote." Isn't that terrible? Because somebody tried to challenge the way things were done. Now we're involved in this bloody mess. Which brings us to our fun-loving Torah portion of Korach. Korach. Korach, for those of you who don't remember from having read through last year, Korach is the Torah portion which presents the most significant challenges to Moses' leadership. The most significant attempt at what you might call a coup or a civil war against Moses. So we'll be looking at some of the parallels, and we'll also hopefully be drawing some of the lessons from Korach for modern day arguments, both among Jews or just in general. All right, so we are on page 860 in your Eitz Chaim Chumash, which is the 16th chapter of the book of Numbers, if you are looking through a different edition. Chapter 16, Bamidbar. Chapter 16, the book of Numbers, page 860, if you're in the Eitz Chaim. We all set? All right. Who'd like to read the journalistic account of the beginning of the Korach strife? Please.
Now Korach, son of Ishar, son of Kehat, son of Levi, betook himself, along with Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, descendants of Reuben, to rise up against Moses, together with 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community, chosen in the assembly, men of repute.
All right. Pause very briefly. So, who's fighting? Who's in this squabble? I want names.
Well, you've got people from the Levites, and you've got Korach,
We got Korach.
and he's a Levite, so he's in the
Where does it say that the Levites are against?
that's it, but I said he's a Levite.
He is. He happens to be a
Right, he
Levite.
happens to be a
Right.
Levite.
So
it's
Korach.
not like he's riffraff.
Are you saying that the rest of us Jews that aren't Levites or Kohanim are riffraff? All right, so we got Korach, who happens to be a Levite, which is important to point out. That means he is from the same tribe as Moses and Aaron. Remember, the Kohanim are not a separate tribe. They are a sub-family of the Levites. All right, so we've got Korach. Who else do we have here?
David and
Datan, right? Oh,
Amiram.
and Aviram.
And On.
On.
And who?
On.
On.
Owen. Son of Peleth.
On, son of
No. It's Datan and Abiram, sons of Elab and On, son of Peleth.
On, son of Peleth.
Well, I mean, there's an argument of whether or not On really is
A name.
a name or part of the genealogy. So he never gets mentioned again in the arguments and the story that unfolds. So he's kind of maybe he's there, maybe he isn't, maybe he's the genealogy, maybe he's another rebel. We're not sure. So
So are they saying that Dathan and Amiram are not brothers? That Dathan is son of Eliab and
that would be one of the interpretations, exactly. But like I said, he never gets mentioned again, so we just won't mention him so much. And then,
son of Peleth.
right, and that's the rest of the genealogy, right?
and 250
chieftains.
chieftains of the community.
Chieftains, all right, that's a pie there. My beautiful penmanship. That's why I didn't become a sofer. Is this a unified bloc? Or is this a coalition of people with different interests that are all unified only in their unhappiness with Moses?
We don't know.
We don't know yet, exactly. But I want to make sure that we understand that that's a possibility. Just like in Syria, just because these people are on the same side versus Moses, doesn't mean that they're on the same side with each other. It just means they all agree that there's something wrong with what's going on with Moses. Keep reading.
They combined against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and the Lord is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourself above the Lord's congregation?"
All right, so what's the general complaint from this combined group?
Who made you holier than that?
Yeah, what made you so special? Who? And they're asking that question not because they're just being smart Alex. I mean, obviously, the short answer to that would be God. And indeed, we already saw a few parshiot ago when Miriam and Aaron were saying things about Moses and his wife, that God made it very clear that Moses was rather special. But here, they're not necessarily saying that Moses shouldn't be above them. They're saying that they are equal to him. It's a subtle difference, I can understand, but in terms of attitude, it's not, why do you think you're better than us because we're lowly and you think you're high? It's, why do you think you're better than us because we're as high as you? We're as good as you. And we have therefore the right to act in the same way as you. We therefore have the right to be equal to you in the service of God and in the adjudication of our people's needs. God did appoint Moses, but there are a couple of issues, as we're going to see from some of the commentary. Because when God appointed Moses, way back at the burning bush, how many other candidates were there? None, right?
But there were no witnesses.
And there were no witnesses, although people have certainly seen Moses act as God's instrument in the
Right.
meantime. But in the meantime, a lot of other things have changed.
Right, but when Moses comes down from the mountain, he's got a clear and visible
Distinction?
sign. Yes.
He's glowing.
Yes.
Okay, so he's glowing, but just because he's glowing, does that mean he gets to tell us what to do?
Well, he's had a different experience than anybody else.
So, here's the question. Let's try and do this graphically. So, this is ground zero. Basic, standard human being worth. And let's say that this is Moses' worth, or his relationship with God, his connection to God, his sanctity. And let's say this, now with having been selected for Torah and having had the Mishkan built and having God dwell among them, this is, we'll just call it us, although I don't want to ally myself with these folks, but we'll call it us for the Israelites. That's us. What's the threshold for leadership? What's the threshold for leadership?
In what?
Well, we recognize that to lead, you have to be better than average. But we've been told that we're better than average by God. We are a nation of priests. We are holy. All of us are holy. God has made that explicit numerous times and in numerous ways. If the threshold to lead is there, then yeah, Moses is even holier than us, but we're holy enough to be leaders too, because God has elevated us. We might not be as holy as him, but you don't have to be the best player to play in the NBA. You just have to be among the best to get one of those spots. And the fact that someone else is better, okay, fine. He gets a bigger salary than me, and that's all very well and good, but that doesn't mean he gets to order me around on the court, because I'm in the same league as he is. And there's a very real perception here because of everything that's happened, because of the mitzvot that have been given and the holiness conferred to the people, because of the Mishkan that's been built that's allowing us to now have a relationship to God in a very formal and accessible way. You know, we don't need to go up on the mountain for 40 days and glow. We can encounter God anytime we want by going to the Mishkan. And we've had prophecy in the camp by people that have now shared from Moses' spirit. Well, you know, we might have reached that threshold.
But there is an intermediary in the Kohanim where you didn't put them in there.
But the Kohanim don't get to tell us what to do. They do what they're told as well.
But not everybody's walking in and making their own sacrifice. They're giving it over to the Kohanim.
And that's the problem, or that's part of the problem, which is who appointed the Kohanim? Moses. And who are the Kohanim? Aaron, which is Moses' brother. If you saw this in American politics, if the president of the U.S. appointed the chief of the Supreme Court as his brother, you wouldn't say, well, I'm sure he's the best person for the job.
He did it as Attorney General.
Back in the 60s, absolutely. And there were a lot of people who did explode over that. Even though Robert Kennedy may have actually been the best person for the job, the imprimatur of nepotism was enough to make us question that selection. And really the people here are asking, in a way, why can't we have a larger share in the ruling and governance of our people? Why can't we be a democracy? Is how we would put it in the modern lingo. And that's not an unreasonable request. It's not, wrong for them to think that the average Jew, having been granted this holiness by God, having been told that they are a nation of priests, not just a nation under priests, having been given the Torah so that they know what they're supposed to do. We got the instruction book, for crying out loud, and having been given a place in our midst where we can encounter and access holiness in a very, very personal way that is akin to what we experienced at Mount Sinai. I'm not sure we need someone of Moses' stature to bring God to us anymore. We're above the threshold, we can do it too. And if so, why should he keep this rulership as his own? Why should he continue to be a de facto king?
But doesn't Moses have a different relationship with God?
Yeah. So?
So wouldn't that elevate him to the point where God doesn't speak directly to us, but he does speak directly to Moses?
So, when we read from the Torah, isn't that God speaking to me?
Yeah.
And are you saying then that somebody who's the best friend of the president deserves to have more stature in the community than the rest of us? They get special privileges? I'm saying they should. I'm not, obviously, in many cases they do, and that's generally not fair. But in terms of our sense of what's right and wrong, just because Moses is able to hang out with God buddy on buddy, does that mean the rest of us don't count for as much? Is our relationship with God only a matter of relative relationship next to Moses' super relationship with God? Or God told us what to do, and we've all got a copy of the book. Back then it would have been orally done, but we therefore have the right and the responsibility to direct our own life according to what God has told us. Now, mind you, I'm not trying to justify the end result of the Korach rebellion. And I'm not trying to justify where Korach and his cronies take it. But the basic question is a legitimate one. And the basic premise of, if God has elevated us now, and we are on the march, and we have our instruction book, and we have our tabernacle, don't we need to rethink the power structure a little bit? Is absolutely a reasonable question to raise. Unfortunately what happens, and then I'll get to the questions, unfortunately what happens is, as soon as the people begin to grumble about this current power structure, you get people who leap in. You get the equivalent in the modern Syrian conflict of the opportunity seekers, who say, well, hey, now that we've already shaken the regime a little bit, now that we've already put it as an open question of, is this the best way to organize ourselves? We can use this to our own advantage. And we can try to become the new Moses, we can try to become the people who are in charge. We're not actually looking for the democracy that the people are looking for, which is mistaken at this time in our history, but we can use their grumbling as our own platform to launch ourselves into the leadership.
Is this possibly a ploy for power? That maybe the time has come when they don't want Moses to tell them what to do, that they want other people who have leadership qualities, would like to be more in charge?
So the question really would be, is this a power ploy? Is this a question of, has the time come for something different? And that's really going to be at the heart of our first commentary, to understand a little bit better what may have been the legitimate reason for some questioning at this time. Again, not necessarily in the style that Korach and his buddies take it, but some questioning that might have been at least understandable, would have been excusable at this time. How are the handouts coming? Do we need more down here, or are we okay? All right, so who would like to read a little Ramban, which I think does a really good job of summarizing why the timing of this event might be very, very important. I should point out there are other commentaries, Ibn Ezra being one of the most famous, that argue that this incident with Korach did not happen at this spot in the apparent timeline of Torah's narrative. Ibn Ezra argues that Korach and his rebellion happened many, many years before, at the beginning of our journey into the wilderness. But most commentators argue no, that Korach actually happened where it looks like it happened, in the timeline of the narrative. Both positions are perfectly fine with general Torah scholarship. There is a well-established rabbinic principle that the Torah was not written with an eye to being 100% chronologically accurate. That occasionally stories are in different positions, and many of those are well attested to and quite easily established. In this particular case, it's up for grabs. I do agree, however, with the commentaries that suggest that this is happening when it looks like it's happening.
Well, my question was, didn't they know what had happened to Miriam? Or did the people not know what had occurred and why she was outside of the camp for 7 days?
You mean, didn't the first protesters see that Assad shot them?
But I mean, even Miriam, his sister, you know, and God firmly answered.
Firmly, that's very diplomatically put.
But so that's my question.
Right.
So did they know what had transpired and why she was outside of the camp?
Absolutely, because the camp refused to move without her, and it was explicit that she's outside and we're not going without her.
Right.
However, that may also be showing the beginning of feelings that what's happening to her didn't entirely please the rest of the camp. You know, when you take someone like a Nelson Mandela and you throw them in jail for arguing against apartheid, that doesn't necessarily make everyone else think, oh, well, if he's in jail, he must be a bad guy. They say, well, if he's in jail, that must mean the regime that put him in jail is even more illegitimate than we thought.
Well, I would have taken it as, you see, Moses really is in a special position because even his own sister can't say those kinds of things. Right,
which possibly could come back to the question of, I don't read the general populace as having a problem with the notion that Moses is special. The question is, they feel that they are special enough to share in the leadership.
Right.
So bad-mouthing Moses, which is essentially what apparently Miriam and Aaron did, is a different crime than saying we're good enough to participate in the leadership and participate in the decision-making process. At which point they would probably have thought that what they were advocating was very different than what Miriam had done. And also, what people were probably advocating is very different than what the named rebel leaders are looking for, which is more of their own rise to power. All right, so who would like to read Little Ramban? Thank you, Kathy.
This incident took place in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh Barnea after the debacle of the spies, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness of Sinai.
Which is the technical term for when we left Egypt and when we were at Mount Sinai itself, which occupied the first 2 years of our departure from Egypt?
They experienced nothing negative, for even with the golden calf, few Israelites died, and Moses averted God's wrath by imploring his mercy for 40 days and 40 nights.
All right, so yeah, perfect, maybe or nothing negative, maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but the problems that we faced were minor. The problems that we had were relatively minor. And even the golden calf, which was the worst incident that happened in that period before we left Mount Sinai, it wasn't a huge slaughter. And Moses was on our side. Moses went and he prayed to God 40 days, 40 nights, and God said, okay, fine, I'm not going to wipe them all out. So he got God to change his mind, apparently. And, you know, that kind of thing impresses the people.
At that time, the people of Israel loved Moshe and would not have tolerated any insurrection against his leadership. Therefore, Korach silently endured the election of Aaron to the priesthood and the appointment of Elazaphan, Korach's junior cousin, to the leadership of the clan of Kahat, and the firstborn tolerated the appointment of the tribe of Levi in their place.
All right.
Leaving.
What's that? Okay, so we got a couple little side notes here that we should explain. So one of them is that Korach's genealogy, which is how we begin this parasha, points out that he was higher in birth order than Elzaphan, who was the one that was chosen to be the leader of the Kahat group of Levites that would be working with the tabernacle. And so probably he was a little miffed. He got passed over for promotion, as you might say. And you know, disgruntled employees are known for causing problems. Similarly, the firstborn, whether it be all of the firstborn or whether it be Reuven, which we also have some co-conspirators coming from, felt that, well, hey, if we were supposed to be the ones who were given the responsibilities of serving God on behalf of all of our brethren, why should the Kohanim, why should Aaron's kids get that job instead of us? Or why should the Levites be given that job instead of us? You know, we redeem the firstborn. We do the ceremony of Pidyon Haben to redeem the firstborn so they don't have to do that work. Well, you ever think that maybe some of the firstborn didn't want to be redeemed? That they would have preferred to have had that status of being the elect servants of God. But since the general population, notwithstanding the firstborn and notwithstanding the people who got passed over by birth order, were happy with what Moses was doing, and were happy that he was on their side, and were happy that most of the time, most of them were not being hurt or punished or suffering, there was no room for a revolution, for a challenge to his leadership to take root. Make sense? Okay. So just as in modern day Syria, as long as Assad seemed unimpeachable, that the common people either were not willing or unable to go out in the streets and argue against him, all of the factions that are now coming out of the woodwork that wanted to attack him didn't have any room to start growing. But as soon as the protesters, peaceful as they were at the beginning, started championing against Assad's rule, now there's some openings where they might be able to find people that will side with them, because now there are people who agree with them that Assad is wrong. They agree for different reasons, but that doesn't mean they can't use them in order to get their own agenda through. Following the politics? All right, keep reading.
However, after entering the wilderness of Paran,
Meaning once they left Mount Sinai,
the people suffered a number of setbacks at Tavera and Kivrot HaTa'ava. After the episode of the spies, Moshe did not pray fervently on their behalf, nor succeed in overturning the decree that the generation would perish in the wilderness and not enter the land.
okay, so what's happened in recent events that might make them annoyed?
We're wandering around.
Wait, I thought we were going straight from Mount Sinai to the land of Israel. And now the spy thing happened, and rather than Moses throwing himself at God's feet and begging for us for 40 days and 40 nights, he seems okay with it. Well, not okay with it, but he's not going to bat for us the way he did with the golden calf. And more importantly, he doesn't get God to change his mind. So maybe Moses' status as being the super one that's always able to get God to do what we the people want God to do is a little tarnished at this point. And plus, we've now just been told we are going to die out here. Maybe 40 years in the coming, but this, looking around, this is going to be our graveyard. What do we got to lose except to challenge this decree? Keep going.
The people of Israel become embittered and begin to think that Moshe's leadership only brought trouble upon them. It was then that Korach chose his moment to act, correctly surmising that his attempted coup would enjoy broad support among the masses.
All right, see the politics, how it works? Nothing like people being unhappy to make demagoguery a lot easier. Okay, that's why, throughout history you see in times of economic turmoil or in times of war or in times of where people are depressed or feeling poorly about their country's world image, demagoguery is much, much easier to come. Whereas during the good years, it's a little harder to play that card.
I really hadn't thought about that before, but it reminds me now of when they first leave Egypt and they say, what, were there no graveyards in Egypt? And that's true. Now they really are going to die out here.
This is going to be their graveyard, exactly.
Yeah.
They said it rhetorically,
Right,
but it was also prophetic,
Yeah.
that the wilderness would be their graveyards. And that kind of thing can upset people. And it doesn't matter, okay, fine, my kids are going to get to Egypt, but I'm not. We can say, looking back throughout the scope of history, okay, that's kind of reasonable. On the other hand, imagine if God just changed the terms of your service once and said, okay, you guys are all gone, but your kids, they'll get to go to the land of Israel. Well, wait a minute, that's what he promised to us when we left Egypt. What's to say our kids don't mess up? And he makes the same decree against them. And then their kids mess up, and he makes the same decree against them. Well, now we're stuck out in the middle of nowhere forever, and so will our kids and our grandkids and great-grandkids, because after all, is anyone ever going to be good enough for God? Is anyone ever going to be perfect enough for God to say, yes, this is the righteous nation that's going to go into our land? We're always going to make mistakes, and if that's God's standard, then I think we need to have a new, we need to have a committee meeting about this. Reasonable? All right, so again, I'm not trying to say that they were right in the eventual target of their grievance, and I'm certainly not saying that the co-conspirators that ride this wave of embitterness are correct. But the basic question itself, where are we going? And are we going to get there? And are we going the right way? And are we handling things the right way? Those questions were, I believe, legitimate and timely. Notice it was time to have the strategic planning session. Okay, which leads us to the question of when do you get to argue and when do you not? And how do you argue? As you might have noticed, as Jews, we have a little bit of a cultural tendency towards argumentation and towards debate. And I don't know whether you've ever experienced that. I'm sure looking around the room, everybody looks aghast at this suggestion. But traditionally, yes, we do have a bit of a reputation for that. But we also have a reputation for setting how we should argue. All right, so let's hit Pirkei Avot. Any takers to read? Are we going to lean on Kathy more? Marion, thanks.
Any controversy which is for the sake of heaven will endure, and that which is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. What is a controversy that is for the sake of heaven? The controversy between Hillel and Shammai, and which is not for the sake of heaven, the controversy of Korach and all dispatch.
All right, L'Shem Shammai, a controversy, a machloket for the sake of heaven. Well, we just gave examples, which you may not be all that familiar with, but don't worry, we'll uncover that. But from your own feelings, what would you say is a controversy for the sake of heaven, as opposed to a controversy not for the sake of heaven?
Well, something that has to do with how well we fulfill some halakha or something for that God has asked us to do.
Are we serving God right? I mean, that's a good question. That's a question that we should always be asking. Are we doing what God has asked us to do? Is this the right way to do this halakha? Is this other way the right way to do halakha? And you have your opinion, I have my opinion. And the goal of both of our arguments, our positions, is the same. We want to do what heaven wants us to do. This is for the sake of heaven. And if you're right at the end of the argument, I don't mind, because that means we're doing what God wants us to do. And if I'm right at the end of the argument, you don't mind, because that means we're doing what God wants us to do.
And if neither of us know which one is right, and we both do our own thing, we both right?
Let's get there. Okay. Marianne, go ahead and keep reading.
Hillel says, a full hin of drawn water renders the ritual bath of purification unfit.
All right, so we're talking about a mikvah. And when you're filling a mikvah, you need 40 seahs of water that is not drawn water. That is to say, you're not piped in from pumps or taken in by buckets. It has to be collected, gathered natural water. And before it's up to 40, before it's up to that minimum measure of a mikvah, if you put in extra water from drawn sources, like say from a well or from the pump out back, the mikvah becomes invalid as a mikvah. And you would have to empty it back down to be dry, and then you have to start all over again with collected waters. Once you reach that 40 seah minimum, you can add in all the extra water you want. All right, now we're not here to discuss the whole laws of mikvah, but this is an argument then of how much wrong kind of water can you put into a mikvah while it's filling and still keep it as a valid mikvah. We got that argument? Okay?
Wouldn't it depend on how big it is?
Nope.
How deep it is?
Nope. It's once it hits the 40 seahs, then it's good no matter what you add to it. And before you hit the 40 seahs, it doesn't matter whether it's very, very shallow and wide or very, very deep. It's a liquid measurement, not a volume, I guess you would say. Yeah. Well, it is a volume measurement, but it's not a spatial measurement.
Proportional.
Exactly. Not proportional. Thank you. Not proportional. So Hillel says a hin of water, that would make it invalid.
And Shammai says 9 calves, which is equal to 3 hin. But the sages say it is not in accordance with the view of the former, or according to the opinion of the latter, that when 2 weavers came from their home near the dung gate in Jerusalem and testified in the name of Shammai and Avtalion, that 3 logs equal to 1 cob.
Less than 1 cob.
Less than 1 cob. Of drawn water render the ritual bath of purification unfit. The sages identified themselves with their view.
All right. Following that? Is it Mishnah fun? So we have, on the one hand, Hillel, who says if you put in a full hin of water, you're in trouble. And you have Shammai, who says if you put in 9 kav, which is 3 hin of water, you're in trouble. And 2 weavers show up and say, well, actually, we can both testify, 2 witnesses, that Avtalion and Shemaiah, which were the teachers of Hillel and Shammai, taught that in fact less than a kav even, but just 3 loaves. It's 4 loaves to the kav, so 3/4 of a kav, I guess, would be the precise measurement. That just 3/4 of a kav would render the mikvah unfit. And the Chachamim, meaning the general sages, agreed with the 2 weavers. They said their testimony is better than the individual testimony of either Hillel or Shammai. People are looking surprised. Yeah?
Because they went to the source.
Because it was 2 agreed
Interesting.
testimony
Right.
of their teachers,
Right.
who is what Hillel or Shammai should have been quoting. Their testimony was considered superior to Hillel and Shammai's, and therefore it was what was followed. And more amazingly, if we turn the page,
And why do they place on record the views of Shammai and Hillel? To no purpose?
which is the great question that we ask often when we're reading the Mishnah, why do we include all the opinions that get thrown out? Why should we should have said, how much water do you need for the mikveh to be invalidated? Well, 2 weavers told us that their teachers told them that it was 3/4 of a kav. And who cares what Hillel and Shammai said? They were wrong. But
In order to teach future generations that a man must not stand on his views, or is it not the case that the fathers of the world
it's the idiomatic word that's used for these folks.
did not stand on their opinions? Of
How are we doing that? That translation rough? All right. So to stand on their opinion appears to be a phrase that means to stubbornly cling to your opinion, even in the face of better evidence to the contrary. It's my opinion, and by virtue of being my opinion, it must be right. Because it's my opinion. And my opinions are always right. And therefore, no matter what you say, I will never agree with you. Or we're familiar with people who argue from those sorts of positions. You know, it's like, well, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, but you're wrong because that's not my opinion.
Why would there not be any discussion with Hillel and Shammai as to why they changed their opinion from what they were taught? You know, I mean, we respect them very much as rabbis of repute.
Absolutely. The fathers of the world, they are called.
They clearly must have had some reason for changing what they've been taught.
Well, for changing what they are taught or
coming to a new conclusion.
teaching something differently than if their memory or if their understanding of their masters would have led them to believe. So it's not necessarily a question of whether they maliciously changed things. It's a question of perhaps they didn't understand clearly what they had been taught, or perhaps they used other teachings to modify what they had been taught because they thought that was the most logical thing to do. But that yielded a conclusion that now was diverse. And this is a question of what do you do with students who come from the same teachers that have differing opinions? This is a question that Mishnah and our tradition has had to wrestle with over and over and over again. Because after all, if we have a chain of tradition that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai, how do you ever end up with two different opinions? Without
And
knowing that...
what if they had, you know, things different in the community? Maybe there were no cobs available, they only had hymns and so forth. You know, I mean, you were supposed to make it so that you can observe things within the context of where you live, just like we now drive on Shabbat, where that would have been anathema, you know.
Certainly, but the answer that there wasn't enough water, and that's why they changed the measurement, would not have really been a valid answer for their generation. And we can argue even whether that be a valid argument for our generation. But the very notion that these two men who studied under the same two masters would come to very different conclusions from what apparently was the true teaching of the masters is a very real experience for every generation of Jews ever since. You know, you have Hasidic teachers that have multiple disciples who go to other cities, and they have new dynasties that violently disagree with each other about what the original master said. You have teachers at Yeshiva University that were said to have said X, but other students say no, they said Y. And the rabbis that come from them violently disagree about what their master said.
But that happens in everything. You know, you have eyewitnesses who give very different testimony.
And the teaching of Ediot here, of the Mishnah, is why then did we bother to record the two guys that we know from the conclusion were wrong? Because it was meant to remind us that no matter who you think you are, no matter how well you think you remember what your teacher taught you, you might be wrong. And don't stubbornly cling to your opinion. Defend it, use it as rigorously and as logically as possible to prove your point, but at the end of the day, you should always be prepared that your opinion, your recollection, your understanding of what you've learned could be wrong, and two weavers know better than you because they remembered it more accurately, or they interpreted it more correctly, or however you want to explain why they got it right when Hillel and Shammai didn't.
Additionally, Hillel and Shammai
Did not what?
agree.
Correct. Correct. Two guys sitting there learning from the same two people, and they walk out of the classroom, and they each look at their notes and go, well, wait a minute, you, me, we have that problem. And that's why we don't simply say, so-and-so is always right. Kind of. We're getting there. Okay? All right, keep going.
Although Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagree.
All right, hold on a second. Who's Bait?
Bait.
Is this Mr. Bait?
The house.
So Beit literally means house when in the compound word form, otherwise it's Bait. And when we say the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, what we're talking about are the academic descendants of Hillel and Shammai as the heads of schools of thought, is the best way of putting it. So the equivalent in Western philosophy of talking about the Pythagoreans and the Platonists. We're talking about people who followed the ideas of Plato or who followed the ideas of Pythagoras. So we're now into the next generations of students of Hillel and Shammai. Now, what did we already know from Hillel and Shammai themselves, who studied under the same teachers? That they could disagree. So what do you think is going to happen in the future generations when you have people who studied under people who disagreed about what they actually shared in common as an original source? What's going to happen to the next generations and further generations of students? More disagreement. Thank you. So keep going. We know they disagree, but what do they do with each other? Nevertheless, although Beit
Shammai did not nevertheless abstain from marrying women of the families of Beit Hillel, nor did Beit Hillel refrain from marrying those of Beit Shammai.
So even though they disagreed vehemently on the status of who was and who was not eligible to marry whom, when their kids came of age to get married, they had no problem marrying into each other's academies. So they might have disagreed about who was eligible and who they, as the rabbi, would do the marriage for. But even though I know that your kids come from a marriage line that perhaps my academy would not agree with, I'm still willing to let your kids marry my kids, and vice versa. That's a major statement of what it means to disagree, but agree that we're still part of the same family. And in fact, they do so by the statement, as you keep reading.
This is to teach you that they showed love and friendship toward one another, thus putting into practice the scriptural text, love, truth, and peace.
Love, truth, and peace, which is a beautiful reminder from Zechariah that's being used here, that normally we tend to think love and truth and peace are opposite. You can sacrifice a little truth in order to make peace. Or you can give up on peace and have a lot more controversy and fighting and demand truth. But what this is saying is that no, you can find a way to have both truth and peace. And it begins by loving and showing friendship to the person that you're arguing with. Again, going back to the notion that Hillel and Shammai, they knew what an argument for the sake of heaven was about. And it meant you didn't hate the person who disagreed with you. You didn't say, I never want to see you marrying the daughter of so-and-so. You just said, I disagree with them, and here are the 5,693 reasons why. And we're going to sit down and argue for the next 20 years on each one of them. That's disagreeing for the sake of heaven, as opposed to disagreeing out of hate or anger. Make sense? It's a high standard. Okay. But he wasn't always so pretty.
And these are some of the regulations enacted in the attic of Hananiah,
That'd be Ben or Bar?
Hezekiah, Ben Gurion, when the rabbis came to visit him. They did a roll call and found that the disciples of Shammai were more numerous than those of Hillel, and they enacted 18 regulations on that day.
Boy, our texts can be cryptic sometimes. All right.
They packed the ring and took it away.
Okay, exactly. How do we generally, in the days of the Sanhedrin, in the days of the rabbinic courts, how would the community, at the end of the day, after all the arguments have been heard, decide what the community was going to do? They'd vote. They'd vote. Just like, current Jewish congregations do as well. At the end of the board meeting or at the end of a topic on a board, we vote. And that's what the congregation's going to do. It doesn't mean you can't have 5 hours of argumentation, but at some point you vote and that's what you do. Well, if you want to make sure your opinion is the one that is accepted, what do?
You pack the house.
You pack the house. You pack the house. You make sure that all of your guys show up so that you have more people on your side. Now, is that illegitimate? I mean, isn't that what we do, every few years in democracy? We get out the vote. If you want to win this election, you make sure all of your supporters get to the polls. You get out the vote. So Shammai didn't do anything wrong here, did they? Even though historically Shammai was always in the minority. So wait a minute. Historically Shammai was always in the minority. So if Shammai was always in the minority, how can they get a majority this time and ram through 18 pieces of legislation?
Because they're meeting in the attic.
Well, first of all, they're meeting in some place that already is not typical, right? When they're meeting up in the attic, they've already got a location for this meeting that is not standard. And secondly, read from the section from the Yerushalmi.
That day was as wretched for Israel as the day which the golden calf was made. It was taught in the names of Rabbi Yehoshua Anayah. The students of Beit Shammai stood below them, and they began to slaughter the students of Beit Hillel. It was taught. 6 of them ascended, and the others stood over them with swords and lances.
All right. So picture, I mean, attic, remember, you don't have to think of the old Victorian house type attic, but an upper chamber of a house. And you send 6 of your guys up the ladder, or up the stairs, and the rest stand down below, swords and spears. And Beit Hillel people show up, and they say, well, we want to go to the meeting. We want to go up for the Beit Din. We want to vote over our dead bodies, or more specifically, over yours. Beit Shammai was willing at this one instant to kill those members of Beit Hillel that were going to vote against them. Is that fair? Is that get out the vote? No. that just makes sure that we understand. I know you're all probably rather stunned by this episode from our history, but that is not considered a legitimate move within Jewish law or within any other democratic system.
Chronologically, how far away from love and truth is that?
How far away from love and truth and being part of each other and machloket l'shem shamayim and all of that is this? We're not sure because unfortunately the Talmud doesn't come with a timestamp for all of its records. What many scholars have hypothesized is that this was in the days that were leading up to the revolt against Rome, which would lead to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Which would put it a good generation or perhaps 2 from when Hillel and Shammai actually lived. So we're maybe 1 or 2 generations down the road when this is happening, if those scholars who are advocating that that's what happened at this point are correct. But the Talmud itself doesn't give us more context than this, and we're left wondering what was so important that Shammai thought they had to kill people to stack the room the way they wanted. And like I said, one of the main arguments that I find quite compelling, just not 100% convinced yet, is whether or not to revolt against Rome. That would be a very good thing that you would feel you were justified in killing your opponents locally in order to have the opportunity to do what was right for the nation on the large scale.
Is this the kind of thing that the rabbis point to when they say that the destruction of the temple was because of what was taking place within the Jewish community as opposed to necessarily what Rome was doing?
It's not pointed to as much as you might think. This particular episode, as I say, is in the Yerushalmi, is where you get the swords and lances, which is not studied as much as the Bavli, as what's called the Babylonian Talmud. And generally speaking, it has been variously interpreted through the ages of whether they actually killed them or didn't really kill them, or maybe it was just killing them with words or convincing them. People have tried to soften the language here a lot. I don't buy the softening personally, and I've seen far too many people, including Jews, be more than prepared to use violence against their brothers and sisters with whom they disagree, and sometimes even on trivial issues, let alone major ones. So it doesn't get used as often, and I think that we are a bit embarrassed by it. This is the only recorded incident within our tradition where violence was used by legitimate groups against each other. We have plenty of recorded incidents of illegitimate groups using violence against each other among the Jewish people. But for 2 established and notable and worthy yeshivot, schools of thought, to use violence, well, one against the other, we don't have any indication that Hillel was actually killing in retaliation, it is just so disturbing that we tend not to talk about it. We just tend to avoid the discussion. But unfortunately, I think it is an important reminder that we have to make sure that we are continually framing our conversations in ways that are l'shem shamayim, that are for the sake of heaven. And one of the foremost principles of heaven is you don't kill another person unless they are actively engaged in violence against you or another person, or you have gone through a full court proceeding to punish them for a crime that they have, by testimony and by evidence, clearly committed, and for which death is the appropriate punishment. There's no other opportunity. You just don't get to kill people that disagree with you. It's just not allowed. It's a big, big no-no in Judaism. And I believe our tradition records that for this very reason. And indeed it goes on to censor Shammai more broadly. And this next section, actually, if Mary will read, is more famously quoted.
Said Rav Abba, said Samuel, for 3 years the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel debated. These said, the law is in accord with our position, and those said, the law is in accord with our position. And Bat-Kol came forth and said, these and those are the words of the living God, but the decided law is in accord with the house of Hillel.
All right. So a Bat-Kol is a rabbinic euphemism for the shadow, the echo of the voice of prophecy, meaning that somehow it was heard from heaven that this was the final decision. And what was the final decision? Yes and no. Right? We're Jews. We do actually have that enshrined in our tradition as being a legitimate answer in many, many occasions. And in this case, heaven itself joins in to say, well, you know, you're both kind of right. But Hillel is the one that you should follow. But it gives you justification for that.
Well then, if it is the fact that these and those both represent the words of the living God, how come the house of Hillel enjoyed the unearned grace of having the law decided in accord with their position?
All right, that phrase unearned grace is a little bit clumsy, but you know, there's a limited amount of space on the page to try and extrapolate what it meant. But what they're saying is they didn't convince the other side, and they didn't have any evidence to convince the great masses of people that they were right. So that should be the only way you win. Right? You're not supposed to win with swords, and you're not supposed to win with heavenly visions. You're supposed to win with logic and evidence, and your ability to command the tradition of your memory of what has been passed down, and your ability to explain it to justify the opinion you've taken. Because presumably your opinion flows from the tradition. You're not just grabbing the tradition and using it as a club to try and justify what you already decided. And Hillel didn't do that, or at least they didn't do it to the satisfaction of their opponents and the rest of the community. That's why the vision was needed. So why did they deserve for the Bat-Kol to say they were right? Keep going.
Because they are easygoing and diffident. They repeated their opinion and also the opinion of the house of Shammai. And not only so, but they gave priority to the teachings of the house of Shammai over their own teachings.
Okay. By priority, they don't necessarily mean they agreed with them more. It means that when they were teaching, they would say, this is what Shammai's house teaches. But here's what we think instead. Whereas when Shammai was teaching, they would say, here's what we think. And that's the difference, says our tradition. That yes, both of them were right. Even though they were both in opposition, both of them can work with what God wants from our people. And that's a very radical theological notion already in and of itself. But you're still left with the question of, okay, well, how do we decide? And the answer is, look for the person that's teaching that is including other opinions in their discussion. Because you will know then that they have considered the other opinions, that they understand the other opinions, and that they can then explain why they reject those opinions and why their opinion is superior. Because someone that only shows you what they believe and refuses to even acknowledge, discuss, or explain any of the valid issues with the other person's opinion is essentially trying to hide things from you. If we go all the way back to our good friends Korach and company, what the people wanted was a better understanding of why things were happening the way they were, why the nation was now headed in what they felt was the wrong direction. They wanted transparency, they wanted to feel like they were involved, and they wanted to know if they weren't going to be involved in making those decisions, why? Why shouldn't they be involved? Why shouldn't they be, if they were high enough in holiness, be able to participate in that discussion? They didn't necessarily have the answers. They just wanted them. They wanted more, what you could call transparency for the process. And what Korach and the others came in and did was say, don't worry, we'll champion you because we're right. Without discussing at all what might have been on the side of Moses and Aaron and what had been done. But we're looking simply to promote their own agenda. So they took a legitimate concern, a legitimate time of strife, and used it to exploit only their own agenda, rather than truly trying to answer the original question that the people had. Which, in the long run, they probably would have been perfectly fine if they had been allowed to hear from Moses what the actual issues were and why, yeah, actually Moses needs to stay as the leader. At least in this point in our history, we did kind of need a Moses rather than the broad council deciding on each and everything. The Torah was still being transmitted, the halakha was still being explained and refined in terms of what the people would understand and how they would implement it. We just had an incident where we had a woodcutter, wood gatherer out there. We had to know what to do about him. We've got some daughters coming up with some inheritance issues. We still need that direct link to God in this generation. And I think that people would have understood that. But as they began to grumble, others jumped in the opportunity and exploited it for their own benefit, which in the end ended up to be neither for their benefit nor for the benefit of the people. Make sense? Questions? Okay. I know it's a heavy subject, but we had the fun topic before we began the video.
Thank you.
Take care.